The bloodied sun sank low on the horizon as Grady Cole rode along the dusty trail, his weathered face creased with the weight of a decade spent in solitude, his only companions the sound of his horse's hooves and the whisper of the unforgiving prairie wind. Wyoming Territory, 1878. Grady had seen his 35th winter come and go without ceremony, marking the passage of time only by the deepening lines around his eyes and the increasing gray at his temples. 10 years had passed since he'd buried his family victims of the fever that had swept through their small homestead and set out westward, unable to bear the emptiness of the home they'd built together. His days followed a predictable pattern, tending cattle on his modest ranch, riding fence lines, and avoiding the growing settlement of Whispering Pines whenever possible. The townsfolk had long since given up trying to draw him into their community affairs, accepting his occasional appearances at the general store and saloon with polite nods rather than conversation. As Grady guided his mare across the rolling landscape, the fading light caught on something in the distance, a small cemetery perched on a gentle rise overlooking the valley. He rarely ventured this way, preferring routes that didn't force him to confront the inevitability of death that had shaped his existence. But tonight, something pulled him toward the weathered wooden crosses and stone markers. He was nearly past when he heard a soft, muffled sound that caused him to rein in his horse. Grady sat motionless, listening. There it came again, unmistakably a woman's sob carried on the evening breeze. Instinct told him to ride on. Whatever grief played out among those graves wasn't his concern. Yet he found himself dismounting, looping his horse's reins around a gnarled juniper and walking with quiet steps toward the sound. She knelt before a fresh grave, her shoulders shaking with each ragged breath. Her dark hair fell in disarray around her face, partially obscuring her profile. Her dress, once fine but now travel-worn, pooled around her in the dirt. So absorbed was she in her sorrow that she didn't notice his approach until his shadow fell across the mound of earth before her. When she looked up, Grady was struck by the raw despair in eyes the color of summer sage. Tear tracks cut through the dust on her cheeks, and her lips trembled with barely contained emotion. "I'm sorry," he said, removing his hat. "I didn't mean to intrude on your grief." The woman hastily wiped at her face, struggling to compose herself. I thought I was alone out here." Her voice was hoarse from crying, but Grady detected an Eastern accent beneath the sorrow. "You are, mostly. My ranch is the nearest property, about 5 miles west." He gestured vaguely toward the horizon. "Grady Cole." "Tessa," she replied, then glanced down at the crude wooden marker. "Tessa Hammond, and this was my father, Thomas Hammond." Grady's eyes moved to the freshly turned earth. "My condolences, Miss Hammond." She nodded, attempting to rise but stumbling slightly. Grady instinctively offered his hand, which she accepted after a moment's hesitation. Her fingers were cold despite the warm evening. "When did he pass?" Grady asked, releasing her hand once she found her footing. 3 days ago. The fever took him." Tessa looked down at the grave. "We were traveling to California. Father had business prospects there after our situation in Boston became untenable. The stagecoach driver helped me bury him, but he couldn't delay the stage. Said I could catch the next one when it comes through in 2 weeks. Grady's brow furrowed. "You've been out here for 3 days? I had our trunks, some food. I couldn't," her voice cracked. "I couldn't just leave him, not yet." The sun had nearly disappeared now, painting the sky in violent streaks of crimson and gold. Night on the plains was no place for a woman alone. "Where are you staying?" Grady asked, though he suspected the answer. Tessa gestured toward a cluster of cottonwoods nearby. "I have a small camp. It's been, adequate." Grady surveyed the area, noting the small bundle of belongings beneath the trees. Something like long, dormant responsibility stirred within him. "Miss Hammond, I don't make a habit of interfering in others' affairs, but I can't in good conscience leave you out here alone. There's a storm coming." He nodded toward the darkening western sky. "My ranch isn't much, but there's a spare room. You'd be welcome to it until the stage comes through." She stiffened, pride temporarily overcoming grief. "I wouldn't want to impose." It's not an imposition. It's common sense. His words came out more gruffly than intended, and he softened his tone. Your father wouldn't want you risking your life keeping vigil. The mention of her father caused fresh tears to well in her eyes. She looked back at the grave, then at her meager camp, and finally at the threatening sky. Perhaps you're right, she conceded quietly. Just until the stage comes. Grady nodded, relieved she hadn't forced him to insist. Let me help with your things. Together they gathered her belongings, 2 trunks, a carpet bag, and a small bundle of food, and secured them to Grady's horse. He helped her mount, then took the reins and began leading the mare toward his property, acutely aware of the strange turn his day had taken. As they moved away from the cemetery, Tessa looked back over her shoulder, her silhouette outlined against the dying light. Goodbye, Father, she whispered, her words nearly lost beneath the rising wind. Grady's throat tightened unexpectedly. He quickened his pace, eager to reach shelter before the approaching storm broke over the prairie, bringing with it rain that would mask the tears he knew were still falling silently behind him. The first heavy drops began to fall as Grady's modest ranch house came into view. The structure stood solitary against the darkening landscape, a 2-room cabin with a small covered porch, weathered by years of Wyoming seasons, but sturdy in its construction. A barn and corral stood nearby, currently housing his small herd of cattle and the 2 horses he kept for working the range. It's not much, Grady said, leading the mare toward the house, but it keeps the elements out. Tessa didn't respond, and when Grady glanced back, he saw her examining the property with an unreadable expression. After years of solitude, he suddenly felt self-conscious about the sparse homestead. There were no flowers planted along the walkway, no curtains in the windows, none of the touches that made a house feel lived in rather than merely inhabited. Let's get inside, he said, helping her dismount as lightning flashed in the distance. I'll see to your things once I've tended to Willow here. Inside, the cabin was clean but austere. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with a worn sofa and reading chair positioned before it. A small table with 2 chairs stood in what served as the kitchen area, while a single shelf held a modest collection of books, Grady's only indulgence. A closed door led to what Tessa presumed was his bedroom. The spare room is through there, Grady said, gesturing to another door as he lit a lamp. It's simple, but the bedding is clean. I use it for storage mostly, but there's space enough. Tessa nodded. Standing awkwardly in the center of the room, her travel-stained dress a stark contrast to the orderly surroundings. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Your kindness is unexpected but greatly appreciated. Grady, he corrected, uncomfortable with formality in his own home. I'll be back shortly. There's water in the pitcher if you'd like to wash up. Outside, the rain fell in earnest as Grady led Willow to the barn, quickly removing her saddle and brushing her down. He took longer than necessary with these tasks, unsettled by the presence of another person in his home after so many years alone. When he could delay no longer, he gathered Tessa's smaller bags and returned to the house, leaving the trunks for morning. He found her standing by the fireplace, which she had taken the liberty of lighting. The warm glow illuminated her features, allowing Grady his first proper look at his unexpected guest. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 25, with a delicate beauty that spoke of genteel upbringing. Even in her disheveled state, there was a dignity in her bearing that commanded respect. I hope you don't mind, she said, gesturing to the fire. The chill was setting in. Not at all. You've saved me the trouble. Grady set her bags near the spare room door. Are you hungry? I don't keep much on hand, but there's beans, bacon, and bread. That sounds wonderful. I've been subsisting on hardtack and jerky these past days. She offered a weak smile. Perhaps I could assist with the preparation? I'm not entirely helpless in a kitchen. Grady hesitated. His kitchen routine, like everything else in his life, had been performed in solitude for so long that the idea of sharing the space felt like an intrusion, but reason prevailed. I wouldn't mind the help, he said, moving toward the small pantry. They worked together in relative silence, the awkwardness gradually easing as they focused on the task at hand. Tessa proved quite capable, despite what Grady assumed was a privileged upbringing that likely included servants. My mother believed every woman should know her way around a kitchen, regardless of station, she explained, seeming to read his thoughts. She passed when I was 16, but not before ensuring I could manage a household. My wife would have agreed with her, Grady said, the words slipping out before he could consider them. Tessa glanced at him, clearly surprised by this revelation, but tactfully refrained from pressing for details. They ate at the small table, the storm raging outside providing a dramatic backdrop to their simple meal. Tessa ate with restrained hunger, maintaining proper manners despite her obvious fatigue and hunger. "How long have you been in Wyoming Territory?" Grady asked, breaking the extended silence. "Just over 3 weeks. We came west from Boston after—" She paused, her fork hovering above her plate. "After my father's business failed. There was a financial panic last year that ruined many. Father believed California offered a fresh start." Grady nodded. News of the Eastern financial troubles had reached even his isolated existence. "It's a common tale out here. Most folks are running toward something or away from something else. And you, Mr. Cole Grady, which are you doing?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "Both, I suppose, though it was more running away at the start. 10 years dulls the sharp edges of most pain." Tessa's eyes softened with understanding. "Yes, I expect it does, though 3 days feels like an eternity at present." "The first year's the hardest," Grady offered, surprising himself with his openness. "After that, you find ways to continue, even when you're not entirely sure why you're bothering." "Is that where you are now? Simply continuing?" Grady considered her question, struck by its insight. "I suppose I was, until recently. And now?" He met her gaze across the table. "Now I'm having dinner with a stranger, and wondering why I'm talking more than I have in months." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Grief makes unusual companions of us all, I think. Thank you for the meal, and for the shelter. I fear what might have happened had you not ridden by when you did." "No need for thanks. Like I said, it's just common sense." After they'd cleaned up, Grady showed Tessa to the spare room. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed against one wall and several crates of supplies stacked neatly in the corner. A small window looked out toward the east, though nothing was visible now except the occasional flash of lightning. "It's not what you're accustomed to, I'm sure," Grady said, "but it should serve until arrangements can be made." "It's perfect," Tessa assured him, sincerity evident in her voice. "After sleeping on the ground these past nights, a real bed seems luxurious beyond measure." Grady nodded, suddenly aware of how close they were standing in the small room. "Well then, good night, Miss Hammond." "Tessa, please." "And good night, Grady." He closed the door behind him, standing motionless in the main room for several moments. The storm outside seemed a fitting accompaniment to the turmoil he felt within, a disruptive force breaking the calm routine of his carefully constructed isolation. Yet beneath the discomfort lay something else, something he wasn't ready to examine too closely, the faint stirring of something like purpose. Grady shook his head and moved to his own room, determined to maintain the emotional distance that had served as his protection for so long. Come morning, he would establish clearer boundaries. After all, she would be gone in 2 weeks, and his life would return to its familiar solitude. But as he lay in his bed, listening to the rain pound against the roof, Grady couldn't shake the image of Tessa kneeling before her father's grave, so utterly alone in her grief. It was an image that followed him into restless dreams, where past and present sorrows blended into a single, persistent ache. Dawn arrived with clear skies and the fresh scent of rain-washed earth. Grady rose with the sun, as was his habit, and moved quietly through the house to avoid waking his guest. He had chores to attend to, cattle to check, a fence section to repair, normal tasks that seemed somehow different with another presence in the house. He was returning from the barn when he spotted Tessa on the porch, watching the sunrise, a quilt from her bed wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and in the soft morning light, she appeared less burdened than the evening before. "You're up early," Grady remarked, climbing the porch steps. Old habits, she replied. Father believed in making the most of daylight hours. She turned to face him. I hope I'm not disrupting your routine. Not at all. I was heading in to start breakfast. Please, allow me to cook this morning. It's the least I can do to repay your hospitality. Grady wanted to refuse cooking for himself, was part of his carefully maintained independence, but the earnestness in her expression made denial difficult. If you insist, I'll fetch your trunks from the barn while you're at it. By the time he returned with the larger luggage, the cabin was filled with the aroma of frying bacon and fresh coffee. Tessa had found his supplies and was managing the cast-iron skillet with practiced ease. Her hair was now neatly pinned up, and she'd changed into a clean dress, simple but well-made, in a shade of blue that complemented her eyes. Something smells good, Grady said, setting the trunks near her room. Just bacon and eggs, I'm afraid. Your pantry is rather bachelor-oriented. There was a gentle teasing in her tone that caught him by surprise. It serves its purpose, he replied, pouring himself coffee from the pot she'd prepared. They ate breakfast with less awkwardness than the previous evening's meal, though conversation remained sparse. Afterward, Grady explained that he needed to ride out to check his herd and repair fencing. Will you be all right here alone? He asked, realizing as he spoke how ridiculous the question was. She'd spent 3 days alone at a gravesite. Surely his cabin offered more comfort. I'll be fine, Tessa assured him. Perhaps I could do some cleaning while you're gone, to earn my keep. Grady frowned. You're a guest, not a servant. I'm aware, but I prefer to be useful, and honestly, Mr. Cole Grady, your kitchen could benefit from a woman's touch. Her eyes sparkled with something that might have been humor. Consider it therapeutic for me, if that eases your conscience. He couldn't argue with her logic, nor did he particularly want to. The idea of returning to a properly organized kitchen was appealing. As you wish, then. I should be back by midday. The morning's ride gave Grady time to think, something he wasn't entirely grateful for. Tessa Hammond was a complication he hadn't anticipated. She was educated, clearly from means despite her current circumstances, and beautiful in a way that made his isolated existence seem suddenly emptier than before. More troubling was how quickly she disrupted his carefully constructed emotional barriers, drawing out conversation and even occasional smiles with an ease that both unsettled and intrigued him. It was temporary, he reminded himself. 2 weeks and she would board the stage for California, leaving him to the solitude he'd chosen after burying Caroline and their infant son. The thought should have comforted him, but instead, it left a hollow feeling in his chest. When Grady returned to the ranch several hours later, he found more than just a cleaned kitchen. Tessa had swept the entire cabin, organized his meager belongings, and even placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the table. The cabin smelled of soap and something baking in the oven. You've been busy, he said, removing his hat as he entered. Tessa looked up from where she was arranging plates on the table. I hope you don't mind. I found some flour and lard and thought I'd try my hand at biscuits. Mind? It smells better in here than it has in years. He moved to the water basin to wash his hands. You didn't have to go to all this trouble. It wasn't trouble. It was... She paused, searching for the right word. Necessary, I think, for me. Grief becomes overwhelming when there's nothing else to focus on. Grady understood that better than most. After Caroline's death, he'd worked himself to exhaustion each day, finding that physical fatigue was the only thing that allowed him to sleep without dreams. Well, I appreciate it all the same, he said, drying his hands on a towel that was considerably cleaner than it had been that morning. They shared a simple but satisfying lunch of leftover beans, fresh biscuits, and coffee. Afterward, Grady mentioned that he needed to ride into town for supplies. Would you like to accompany me? He asked, surprising himself with the invitation. You could inquire about the stage schedule while we're there. Tessa hesitated. Are you certain? I wouldn't want to impose further. It's no imposition. I need to go anyway, and you might benefit from some fresh company besides my taciturn self. This earned him a small smile. I find your company perfectly adequate, but yes, I would appreciate the opportunity to make arrangements. The ride to Whispering Pines took just under an hour. The town was small but growing, consisting of a main street with the essential businesses general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a small hotel that also served as the stagecoach office. A church stood at one end of the street, while the sheriff's office anchored the other. Grady felt the familiar tension that accompanied his rare visits to town. He deliberately kept his distance from the community, attending to business efficiently and avoiding social entanglements. Now, riding in with a beautiful woman beside him, he knew there would be talk. As expected, their arrival drew attention. Grady helped Tessa down from Willow, acutely aware of the curious gazes from the boardwalk and store windows. "Folks don't see many new faces around here," he explained quietly, "and they see even less of me." "The mysterious recluse and the stranger," Tessa murmured, adjusting her hat. "We make quite the spectacle, I imagine." They were approached almost immediately by Sheriff Daniel Latimer, a fair but no-nonsense lawman who had served the community for nearly a decade. "Cole," he greeted with a nod. "Been a while since you've graced us with your presence." His eyes moved to Tessa, curiosity evident but restrained by professional courtesy. "Sheriff," Grady replied, "this is Miss Tessa Hammond. She's traveling through to California and waiting on the next stage." "Madam," Latimer tipped his hat. "Sorry to hear about your father. Stage driver mentioned it when he came through. You found accommodations then?" "Mr. Cole has kindly offered his spare room until the stage arrives," Tessa explained, her voice steady despite the public acknowledgement of her loss. The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly, but he maintained his composure. "That's mighty generous. The stage should be through next Friday, assuming the creek crossing at Miller's Pass doesn't give them trouble. You can confirm at the hotel office." "Thank you, Sheriff," Tessa replied with a polite smile. As they continued toward the general store, Grady felt the weight of speculative stares. He was used to being the subject of gossip, the widower who rejected all attempts at friendship, the man who spoke only when necessary. But this was different. There would be assumptions about Tessa's presence at his ranch, judgments about propriety, and likely offers of more suitable arrangements from well-meaning townsfolk. Inside the general store, Mrs. Abigail Foster greeted them with poorly concealed surprise. A plump, matronly woman with a penchant for community affairs, she had tried for years to draw Grady into the social fabric of Whispering Pines. "Mr. Cole, what a pleasant surprise," she said, moving from behind the counter, "and you've brought company." Her gaze swept over Tessa with frank assessment. "Mrs. Foster," Grady nodded. "This is Miss Hammond. She's passing through to California." Tessa extended her hand with practiced grace. "A pleasure, Mrs. Foster. Your store is wonderfully stocked for such a remote location." The older woman preened at the compliment. "We pride ourselves on offering the necessities and a few luxuries besides. Are you staying at the hotel, dear?" Before Tessa could answer, Grady interjected. "Miss Hammond is my guest until the stage arrives. I'll need to stock up accordingly." Mrs. Foster's expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and finally settled on a knowing smile that made Grady's jaw tighten. "Of course, Mr. Cole. How thoughtful of you to offer your hospitality." While Grady selected flour, coffee, sugar, and other staples, Tessa wandered the store, occasionally adding small items to their purchases: spices, dried fruit, a bolt of simple cotton fabric. When they reached the counter to pay, she attempted to contribute. "Please," she said quietly, "you've been more than generous." Grady shook his head. "Consider it part of your room and board." He turned to Mrs. Foster. "We'll take these items, and have you any letters for me?" The storekeeper produced a single envelope from beneath the counter. "Just this one. Arrived on yesterday's stage." After settling their account, they made their way to the hotel to inquire about the stagecoach. The clerk confirmed the sheriff's information: the next westbound stage would arrive Friday, barring any complications. "That gives us just over a week," Tessa said as they exited the hotel. "I should find some way to occupy myself and be useful during that time." "You don't need to be useful," Grady replied, leading her toward the livery where they'd left Willow. "Rest and recover your strength for the journey ahead." "I've never been one for idleness, especially now when it leaves too much time for reflection." She glanced around the bustling street. "This seems a pleasant enough town." It serves its purpose, Grady said noncommittally. They were nearly to the livery when a voice called out, "Grady Cole, as I live and breathe." Grady turned to see Gerald Walsh, owner of the town's only saloon, and one of the few people Grady might reluctantly call a friend. Gerald had been the first person to welcome him to the area 10 years ago, offering work when Grady was still raw with grief and uncertain of his future. "Gerald," Grady acknowledged with a nod. The saloon keeper approached, his jovial expression reflecting genuine pleasure at the encounter. "Twice in 1 month? The town might faint from shock." His gaze moved to Tessa, curiosity tempered with the discretion that made him a successful businessman. And who might this lovely lady be? After introductions were made and Tessa's situation briefly explained, Gerald insisted they join him for a meal at the saloon. "Hannah's made her famous stew today," he said, referring to his wife, who managed the kitchen. "Best meal in the territory, and I won't take no for an answer." Grady was inclined to refuse, but Tessa spoke first. "That sounds wonderful, Mr. Walsh. We'd be delighted." The meal proved more enjoyable than Grady had anticipated. The saloon was respectable by frontier standards, with a separate dining area for families and ladies. Hannah Walsh was a warm, motherly woman who took an immediate liking to Tessa, ensuring their table was well supplied with fresh bread, stew, and apple pie. Conversation flowed easily, with Gerald and Hannah doing most of the talking. They shared town news and regional happenings, carefully avoiding direct questions about Tessa's background or future plans. It was the kind of social interaction Grady had deliberately avoided for years, yet he found himself almost relaxed as the meal progressed. "You should bring Miss Hammond to the social on Saturday," Hannah suggested as they finished their pie. "Nothing fancy, just folks gathering at the church for music and conversation. Would be a nice way to spend an evening before her departure." Grady began to formulate a polite refusal, but Tessa spoke first. "That sounds lovely, Mrs. Walsh. What do you think, Grady? Might we attend?" Put on the spot, he found himself nodding against his better judgment. "If you'd like?" Hannah beamed. "Wonderful. The ladies will be thrilled to meet you, dear. We don't get many new faces, especially ones with proper Eastern manners." As they rode back to the ranch later that afternoon, Grady maintained a thoughtful silence. The day had unfolded in ways he couldn't have predicted, drawing him further into social obligations he'd spent years avoiding. "You're uncomfortable with the social," Tessa observed as the ranch came into view. "We needn't attend if it troubles you." Grady sighed. "It's been a long time since I participated in community gatherings. I'm out of practice." "Yet you agreed?" "You seemed interested," he said simply. Tessa studied him with a perceptive gaze. "You're an unusual man, Grady Cole. You cultivate solitude like others tend gardens, yet you've opened your home to a stranger and accommodated her wishes against your own inclinations. There's nothing unusual about basic decency." "No, but there's something remarkable about genuine kindness delivered without expectation of recognition or reward." She looked ahead to the ranch house. "I won't press you on the social. We can send word that we're unable to attend." Grady considered her offer, tempted to accept the reprieve, but something in him rebelled at the thought of disappointing her. "No, we'll go. It's just one evening." The week that followed established an unexpected rhythm to their days. Mornings began with shared breakfast before Grady tended to ranch work. Tessa occupied herself with domestic tasks, cooking, mending, and even starting a small garden beside the porch. In the afternoons, Grady would often find her reading one of his books or working on a dress she was fashioning from the fabric purchased in town. They spoke more freely as days passed, sharing stories of their lives before circumstances brought them together. Grady learned that Tessa had been engaged to a banker's son in Boston, but the match dissolved when her father's financial ruin became public knowledge. She spoke of this without bitterness, expressing instead a sense of having narrowly escaped a loveless marriage of convenience. Perhaps it was a blessing disguised as misfortune, she mused one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I might have spent my life in gilded confinement, hosting dinners for people I scarcely liked and raising children to continue the same empty tradition." Grady found himself sharing more of his own past than he had with anyone in years. He told her about meeting Caroline when they were both barely 20, their hasty wedding when her family disapproved of his modest prospects, and their journey west to build a life on their own terms. "We had 2 good years in Nebraska before the fever took her and our son," he said, his voice low but steady. "After burying them, I couldn't bear to stay. Every corner of that house held memories that cut like knives." "So you came here to forget?" Tessa asked gently. Grady shook his head. "To remember without drowning in it. There's a difference." As Saturday approached, Grady noticed Tessa growing increasingly anxious about the social. The dress she was making occupied most of her free time, and she spent longer each morning arranging her hair. "You needn't worry about impressions," he told her the day before the event. "You'll outshine every woman there regardless of your attire." The compliment slipped out unintentionally, and both of them seemed startled by its directness. Tessa's cheeks colored slightly. "Thank you, but it's not vanity that motivates me. I simply wish to honor the occasion and the community's hospitality with my best appearance." "Of course," Grady replied, embarrassed by his presumption. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise." The social itself proved both better and worse than Grady had anticipated. The church hall was decorated simply but warmly, with lanterns casting a golden glow over long tables laden with food brought by community members. A small group of musicians played familiar tunes in one corner, while clusters of people conversed throughout the space. Their arrival caused a brief lull in conversation before Gerald Walsh approached to welcome them. Tessa, wearing her newly completed dress of blue cotton with simple embroidery at the collar and cuffs, made an immediate positive impression. Her natural grace and genuine interest in others soon had her engaged in conversation with several of the town's women. Grady found himself cornered by men curious about his unexpected sociability and his beautiful companion. He deflected questions about Tessa with practiced brevity, steering conversations toward safer topics like cattle prices and weather patterns. "She's a fine woman," Sheriff Latimer commented as they stood watching Tessa laugh at something Hannah Walsh had said. "Seems to be handling her grief with remarkable strength." "She is," Grady agreed, unable to elaborate further without revealing the depth of his growing admiration. "Shame she's continuing on to California," the sheriff continued, giving Grady a sideways glance. "Territory could use more women of quality." Grady made a non-committal sound, unwilling to acknowledge the implication behind Latimer's words. Yes, it was a shame she was leaving, but he had no right to wish otherwise. Her life awaited her in California, and his remained here, in the solitude he'd chosen. Yet, as the evening progressed and he watched Tessa move through the gathering with quiet dignity and genuine warmth, Grady found himself imagining what it might be like if she stayed. The thought both terrified and tantalized him. The musicians struck up a waltz and couples began to form on the makeshift dance floor. Grady hadn't danced since Caroline's death and had no intention of starting now. He was making his way toward the refreshment table when Gerald intercepted him. "Your lady looks like she'd appreciate a turn around the floor," he said, nodding toward Tessa, who stood watching the dancers with wistful eyes. "She's not my lady," Grady replied automatically. Gerald raised an eyebrow. "Maybe not, but she's under your protection for now. Would be a kindness to offer her a dance." Before Grady could formulate a refusal, he found himself moving toward Tessa, drawn by some impulse he couldn't name. She looked up as he approached, surprise and something else flickering across her features. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. Tessa hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I would, thank you." It had been years since Grady had held a woman in his arms, and the sensation was both familiar and strangely new. Tessa fit against him with unexpected rightness, her hand warm in his, her steps matching his as though they'd danced together countless times before. "You're quite good at this," she remarked, looking up at him with genuine surprise. "I wouldn't have expected a rancher to be so accomplished on the dance floor. My mother insisted all her sons learn, said a man who could dance would never lack for female company." The memory brought a faint smile to his lips. "I haven't put her teaching to use in a very long time." "Well, She taught you well." Tessa's eyes held his, and for a moment the room around them seemed to fade away. "Thank you for this evening, Grady. It's been healing, somehow." The vulnerability in her voice touched something deep within him. "I'm glad," he said simply, unable to express the confusing tangle of emotions her presence had awakened. They danced twice more before the evening ended, drawing curious and approving glances from the townsfolk. As they rode home under a canopy of stars, a comfortable silence between them, Grady found himself dreading the approaching Friday more acutely than he'd anticipated. 4 days. That was all the time remaining before the stage would take Tessa away from Whispering Pines, away from him. The thought left an ache in his chest that he hadn't felt since the raw days after Caroline's death. Different in nature, but similar in intensity. It was the pain of impending loss, of possibility slipping away before it could fully form. The following days passed too quickly. Tessa began organizing her belongings for travel, while Grady found increasingly flimsy reasons to delay his usual ranch work in favor of remaining near the house. They continued their evening conversations on the porch, each now tinged with the awareness of their dwindling time together. On Wednesday afternoon, a summer thunderstorm rolled in unexpectedly, trapping them indoors. Tessa sat by the window, watching the rain with a pensive expression, while Grady attempted to focus on mending a bridle. "I've been thinking," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence, "about my father's plans for California." Grady set aside the bridle, giving her his full attention. "What about them?" "He had a business associate there, a Mr. Hartley, who offered him a position in his shipping company." She turned from the window to face Grady. "I've been wondering if the offer would extend to me in his absence." "It might," Grady said carefully. "Many businesses need clerks with good penmanship and figures." Tessa nodded, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the quilt beside her. "That's what I thought. But then I realized I know nothing about this Mr. Hartley beyond my father's brief mentions. I have no guarantee of employment, no certainty of welcome." "That's true of most journeys west," Grady observed. "People come on hope and promises that sometimes materialize, and sometimes don't." "Yes, exactly." She met his gaze directly. "Which has led me to wonder if I'm being foolish, pursuing such uncertainty when I could—" She trailed off, seeming to lose her nerve. "When you could what?" Grady prompted, his heart beating faster despite his efforts to remain calm. "When I could consider alternatives," she finished, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Whispering Pines seems a growing community. Perhaps there might be opportunities here." The implication hung between them, delicate as a soap bubble and just as fragile. Grady chose his words with care, terrified of saying too much or too little. "I expect the town would welcome you gladly," he said. "Mrs. Foster mentioned needing help at the store, and I believe the school board is seeking a teacher for the fall term." "And you?" Tessa asked, her eyes never leaving his face. "Would you welcome my decision to stay?" The directness of her question left no room for evasion. Grady swallowed hard. Years of practiced emotional restraint warring with the unexpected hope her words kindled. "I would," he admitted finally. "More than I have right to say." Tessa's expression softened. "Why wouldn't you have the right? You hardly know me. A week of shared meals and conversations doesn't provide foundation enough for the kind of decision you're contemplating." "Perhaps not under normal circumstances," she conceded, "but grief has a way of stripping away pretense. I've seen your true character, Grady, in your kindness to a stranger, your respect for my independence, your quiet strength. Those qualities reveal more than months of conventional courtship ever could." Grady moved to sit beside her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "I've lived alone for 10 years. I'm set in my ways, stubborn and sometimes difficult. The life I could offer is simple, lacking the refinements you were raised with." "Those refinements brought me little joy," Tessa replied, "and solitude can be unlearned, just as it was learned." She hesitated, then continued softly, "I'm not asking for declarations or promises, Grady. Only the chance to see if what I believe is beginning between us might grow into something meaningful." Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating her face in stark relief. In that brief moment of clarity, Grady saw not just the beautiful woman before him, but the possibility of a future he'd long since abandoned hope of finding. "Stay," he said simply. "Not for me, not yet. But stay for yourself, to see if this place might become home. And if, in time, you find your feelings changing or your ambitions leading elsewhere, I'll help you continue your journey without resentment." Tessa's smile bloomed slowly, transforming her face with quiet joy. "A fair proposal. I accept." The decision made, they spent the remainder of the evening making practical arrangements. Tessa would take a room at the boarding house in town while seeking employment, establishing herself as part of the community rather than merely as Grady's guest. This would allow their relationship to develop naturally, free from the constraints and gossip that might arise from continued residence at his ranch. "It's for the best," Tessa insisted when Grady expressed reluctance about the arrangement. "I need to stand on my own feet. And you need time to adjust to the idea of having someone in your life again. We can court properly, like any other couple." The word couple sent an unexpected thrill through Grady. After so many years of deliberately avoiding attachments, the prospect of intentionally forming one was both exhilarating and terrifying. Friday arrived with clear skies and a sense of anticipation rather than dread. They rode into town together, Tessa's trunks loaded on Grady's wagon. The stagecoach was already waiting when they arrived, passengers disembarking while others prepared to board for the journey west. Mrs. Whitfield, the widow who ran the boarding house, greeted Tessa warmly. "Your room is all prepared, dear. Such a pleasure to have a young lady of refinement joining our little community." While Tessa's belongings were being transferred to her new accommodations, Grady approached the stagecoach office to send a telegram to Mr. Hartley in San Francisco, explaining Thomas Hammond's passing and his daughter's decision to remain in Wyoming Territory for the time being. "Covering all possibilities," he explained to Tessa afterward. "If this Hartley fellow is honorable, he should know what happened to your father, and if circumstances change, having made the contact might prove useful." Tessa regarded him with appreciation. "That was thoughtful. Thank you." They stood somewhat awkwardly outside the boarding house, their new arrangement suddenly feeling artificial after the easy companionship of the past week. "Will you come for dinner on Sunday?" Tessa asked. "Mrs. Whitfield says boarders may entertain guests in the parlor until 8 o'clock. "I'd like that," Grady replied, relief evident in his voice. "Until then, I'm at your service if you need anything." As he prepared to leave, Tessa surprised him by placing a hand on his arm. "I made the right decision," she said softly. "I knew it when I woke this morning with anticipation instead of dread." Grady covered her hand with his own. "I hope you'll continue to feel that way." The weeks that followed brought changes both subtle and profound to their lives. Tessa quickly secured a position at the general store where her Eastern education and meticulous handwriting proved valuable for inventory and correspondence. She integrated herself into the community with natural grace, joining the church choir and assisting with the planning of the upcoming Harvest Festival. Grady, meanwhile, found himself gradually drawn into town life through his connection to Tessa. Sunday dinners in the boarding house parlor became a fixed ritual, often extending to include walks through town afterward. Occasionally, they rode out to his ranch together, where Tessa continued to tend the small garden she'd started during her stay. Their courtship progressed with measured steps, each careful not to rush the other. Grady found himself recalling long-forgotten social graces, bringing small gifts when he called, offering his arm during their walks, engaging in conversation with neighbors he'd previously avoided. For her part, Tessa never pressed him beyond his comfort, seeming to intuitively understand his need to move slowly after years of isolation. By late September, as the aspen leaves turned golden on the hillsides, their relationship had become an accepted fact in Whispering Pines. No one seemed surprised when Grady reserved 2 seats together for the Harvest Festival dance, or when Tessa wore the brooch he'd ordered specially from Denver. The night of the festival, under a canopy of stars and lantern light, Grady finally found the courage to speak of feelings he'd been harboring for weeks. "I never expected to find happiness again," he said as they stood apart from the celebration, watching fireflies dance above the meadow grass. "After Caroline died, I convinced myself that part of my life was finished, that I'd had my chance at love, and lost it." Tessa listened silently, her face illuminated by the distant lanterns. "But then you appeared grieving, vulnerable, yet somehow stronger than anyone I'd ever met." He took her hand, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "You woke something in me that I thought had died years ago. Hope, purpose, the desire to build rather than merely exist." "Grady," she began, but he shook his head. "Please let me finish while I have the courage." He drew a deep breath. "I love you, Tessa, not as a replacement for what I lost, but as something entirely new and unexpected. I don't have much to offer beyond myself and whatever future we might build together, but if that's enough—" She silenced him with a finger to his lips. "It's more than enough," she whispered. "I love you too. I think perhaps I began falling in love that first night, when you offered shelter to a stranger simply because it was the right thing to do." Grady's hand trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket. "Then would you consider making our arrangement permanent?" He produced a simple gold band, set with a small pearl. "It was my mother's. I've kept it all these years, never thinking I'd have reason to offer it again." Tears glistened in Tessa's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Yes, Grady Cole, I will marry you." The news of their engagement spread quickly through Whispering Pines, met with widespread approval and no small amount of self-congratulation from those who claimed to have predicted it from the start. Hannah Walsh insisted on hosting an engagement dinner at the saloon, while Reverend Phillips offered the church for a wedding before winter set in. November would be lovely, Tessa suggested one evening as they discussed dates. After harvest, but before the heavy snows, it would give us time to prepare the ranch house for winter together. The mention of the ranch house prompted a conversation they'd been postponing where they would live after marriage. Tessa had grown fond of town life and the connections she'd formed there, while Grady's ranch represented both his livelihood and his independence. "We could split our time," Grady proposed. "Maintain rooms in town for the winter months when travel is difficult, and live primarily at the ranch during the growing season." "That seems a sensible compromise," Tessa agreed, "and perhaps in time, as the town grows, the distance won't seem so formidable." Their wedding took place on the first Saturday in November, with golden leaves still clinging to the cottonwoods along the creek. The church was filled with townsfolk who had come to respect Tessa for her own merits and to marvel at the transformation in Grady. Gerald Walsh stood as Grady's best man, while Hannah served as Tessa's matron of honor. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply moving. Tessa wore a dress of ivory silk ordered from Denver, with her mother's lace veil that she'd carried west in her trunk. Grady, looking uncomfortable but distinguished in a new suit, watched her walk down the aisle with an expression of such naked adoration that several of the town's matrons dabbed at their eyes. "I never thought I'd see the day," Gerald commented as they signed the marriage registry afterward. Grady Cole, the most determined loner in the territory, looking at a woman like she hung the moon and stars. "She did," Grady replied simply, his eyes never leaving his bride. The celebration continued at the hotel dining room, where a feast had been prepared and a small band assembled for dancing. Tessa and Grady moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes with grateful smiles. As the evening progressed, more than one person remarked on the unlikelihood of their union, the reserved rancher and the refined Easterner, brought together by chance and grief, now embarking on a shared future. "It wasn't chance," Tessa corrected gently when Mrs. Foster made such an observation. "It was providence. I believe we were meant to find each other, though neither of us was looking." Their wedding night was spent at the ranch, which had undergone subtle transformations in preparation for Tessa's permanent residence. Curtains hung at the windows, a colorful quilt adorned their bed, and the kitchen gleamed with new cookware. But the most significant change was less visible. The atmosphere of loneliness that had permeated the place for so long had been replaced by something warmer and more hopeful. As winter settled over the territory, Grady and Tessa established rhythms to their shared life. They spent weekdays at the ranch, with Grady tending livestock and Tessa managing the household while continuing her work on inventory records for the general store, which she now completed from home. Weekends often found them in town, attending church and socializing with friends who had once been mere acquaintances to Grady. Their love deepened with each passing month, growing from the initial attraction and mutual respect into something more substantial. They learned each other's habits and histories, sharing stories from their separate pasts while creating new memories together. Grady spoke more openly of Caroline and their son, finding that remembering them with Tessa somehow eased rather than sharpened the old pain. In turn, Tessa confided her fears about the future and her occasional homesickness for the familiar rhythms of Eastern life. Spring brought new beginnings. The garden Tessa had started expanded to include vegetables and herbs, while Grady added to his cattle herd and began improvements on the barn. Together they planted saplings around the house, cottonwoods, aspens, and even a few apple trees ordered from a nursery in Denver. "These won't bear fruit for years," Grady commented as they tamped soil around the delicate roots. "Then we'll have something to look forward to," Tessa replied, wiping perspiration from her brow. "I like the idea of planting things that will outlast us." By summer's arrival, Tessa had news that brought both joy and anxiety. She was expecting their first child due in the early winter. Grady's reaction was a complex mixture of elation and fear, memories of his previous loss casting shadows over his happiness. "I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you," he confessed one night as they lay together, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "Nothing will happen," Tessa assured him, though they both knew such promises were beyond anyone's power to keep. "Dr. Marshall says I'm in excellent health, and Hannah has delivered dozens of babies over the years. We'll take every precaution." As Tessa's pregnancy progressed, Grady threw himself into preparations with determined intensity. He expanded their bedroom to accommodate a cradle, improved the house's insulation against the coming winter, and even arranged for a telephone line to be installed, one of the first in the area, to ensure they could summon help if needed. The community rallied around them with practical support and advice. Women who had successfully birthed children on the frontier shared their experiences with Tessa, while men who had become fathers offered Grady their own perspectives on parenthood. What might have once felt like intrusion now registered as genuine care, a testament to how fully they had integrated into the life of Whispering Pines. In late November, as the first significant snowfall blanketed the landscape, Tessa went into labor. True to their winter plan, they were staying in their town rooms, a fortunate decision given the intensity of the storm that accompanied their child's arrival. Hannah Walsh and Dr. Marshall attended the birth, while Grady paced the parlor downstairs, his features drawn with anxiety. After 14 hours of labor, as dawn broke over the snow-covered town, their daughter entered the world with a robust cry that could be heard throughout the boarding house. When Grady was finally permitted to enter the bedroom, he found Tessa pale but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle with a shock of dark hair. "Meet your daughter," she said, her voice tired but triumphant. "Grace Carolyn Cole." Grady approached the bed with reverence, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he beheld his child for the first time. When Tessa placed the infant in his arms, he felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. Love and fear and gratitude all mingled together in overwhelming intensity. "She's perfect," he whispered, counting tiny fingers and marveling at the delicate features that somehow combined his own and Tessa's. "You're both perfect." The birth of Grace changed their lives in ways both expected and surprising. The practical adjustments to life with an infant were challenging but manageable. More profound were the emotional shifts, the deepening of their bond as they navigated parenthood together, the expansion of their capacity for love, and in Grady's case, the healing of old wounds as he embraced fatherhood a second time. By spring, they had settled into new routines that accommodated Grace's needs while maintaining the life they'd built together. They returned to the ranch full-time, where the apple saplings were putting forth their first tentative leaves, and the garden awaited Tessa's attention. The house that had once stood as a monument to solitude now vibrated with life and purpose. On a warm evening in May, as they sat on the porch with Grace sleeping peacefully in Tessa's arms, Grady reflected on the strange path that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, I was convinced my life would continue exactly as it was until the end alone, unchanging, half-lived, he said, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. I never imagined this. Tessa leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. When I knelt at my father's grave that day, I thought my future had died with him. I couldn't see beyond my grief to any possibility of happiness. And then I came along and disrupted your mourning, Grady said with a faint smile. You did more than that, Tessa corrected him. You showed me that grief and hope can coexist. That endings sometimes lead to beginnings we couldn't have imagined. Grady placed a gentle kiss on her forehead, then on Grace's downy head. I'm grateful every day that I took that particular trail home, that I stopped instead of riding past. As am I, Tessa murmured, every single day. As twilight deepened around them, stars appearing one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, they sat in contented silence. The ranch that had once been Grady's solitary refuge had transformed into a true home, filled with the love he'd thought forever beyond his reach. And Tessa, who had arrived with nothing but grief and uncertainty, had found not just shelter, but a future rich with possibility. Together they had built something neither could have created, alone a life that honored their separate pasts while embracing their shared present. And as their daughter slept peacefully between them, their story continued to unfold against the backdrop of the wild frontier that had brought them together.